All right, so this is the second lecture from the chapter 7 of the textbook, where I'm going to walk through the perspective of Jean Piaget. So you may have heard of Piaget already when you took Human Growth and Development, if you've taken that. And so I'm going to walk through the some of that theory that you probably learned, but I'm going to try to also speak more broadly about what does his theory say that sort of in the context of these cognitive theories, how does it sort of expand our understanding of the way that we process information about the world? So first off, his theory is a developmental cognitive position. It is a developmental position because it recognizes that the way we think about the world changes over the course of the lifespan. Of course, we heard a little bit about that in the last section from Brunner, who said, okay, there's inactive, iconic, and symbolic. So Jean Piaget, I think, does a better job of talking about the developmental changes that occur in how we understand the world around us. But it's a developmental and a cognitive. So it's blending those together and saying, of course, there's physical development that occurs, but really emphasizing there's cognitive developments that occur in how we understand the world around us. So first off, just want to point out Piaget's research and theories have been highly influential in psychology and even in education. They often familiarize themselves with his work, and the cognitive and developmental, I already kind of walked through that. So, okay, a little bio sketch on Jean Piaget. I love that picture of him. It's great. Just makes me smile. So he obtained his PhD in biology at the age of 22. Then after finishing school, he worked at a psychoanalytic clinic and eventually in Alfred Binet's laboratory. Binet, I don't know if you've heard of the Stanford Binet intelligence test. So they administered this intelligence test to young children to standardize the items. And he held a lifelong interest in the thought processes of children. His theoretical orientation is that human development is a process of adaptation, that we are just ongoing trying to adapt to the world around us. And the highest form of human adaptation is cognition or knowing. So we adapt in a lot of different ways. We avoid things that are hot. We plant. I'm just thinking of the things that animals can do. They learn to hunt in particular ways and store up food for the winter, things like that. But in humans, it's this idea that we think about the world, we plan, we understand the world around us. And so, according to Piaget, there's two big questions. What characteristics of children enable them to adapt to their environment? And then what's the simplest, most accurate, most useful way of classifying child development? And in doing so, Piaget, of course, he was a biologist, and so it's clearly biological and evolutionary, right? Because he's talking about adaptation, and evolution is all about survival of the fittest and adapting to the world around us. But again, he's blending in this cognitive perspective as well. Okay, and make my video a little smaller. So Piaget says we adapt through a process, really a balance of two processes, the process of assimilation and then the process of accommodation. So these are strategies. So what assimilation is where we take new experiences and put them into existing representational systems. So an infant will obviously an infant will nurse and or suck on a bottle, so it knows the world through this process of sucking, right? It's got the oral stage, but then when it encounters a new toy, all right, it has a schema I know things, or I satisfy myself through sucking. And so it sticks the toy into its mouth. And that's not what you're supposed to do with a toy, but that's what a child does. So it is interacting with something new, with the schema of, I'm going to suck things that to get satisfaction from them, right? If later on, kids will learn that, no, I don't stick it in my mouth. I can actually play with it, interact with it. But at that stage, it's just fitting it into its own system, its own schema. A new graduate might attend a business meeting, being quiet and passive like they were in school, and not realizing that actually you're supposed to speak up, give perspective. And again, they're assimilating a meeting as, oh, this is a classroom experience where I just sit back and hear, as opposed to participate. Then in some circumstances, we accommodate. We take new experiences and alter our representational system. So again, the toddler learns a toy can be played with. Graduate learns that their own thoughts can be introduced. So this is the idea that the way that they were relating with the world changes. So they develop a sort of the altered schemas, and they recognize, okay, I need something new in this situation. So I mentioned that this is a balance. There should be an equilibrium of this. If you're using too much assimilation, there's no learning. There's no capacity for seeing the world or experiencing the world in a different way. If there's too much accommodation, though, behavior becomes chaotic, right? We need stability. If I was always approaching every situation and saying, oh, maybe this is a completely new experience, well, I would be like, I'd come to a restaurant and be like, okay, how am I supposed to behave here? What am I supposed to do here? And I might like start dancing, just a joke. But like, if I didn't have a schema for, in a restaurant, I sit at the table, I speak kindly to the waiter or waitress, I look at the menu. If I didn't have a schema that I would recognize as, this is what I should be doing in this situation, then I'd be accommodating, but it wouldn't be helpful. It would be chaos, right? So we should have this balance between treating things as like past experiences, and treating things as new, and allowing ourselves to sort of adapt to the new situations. And one of the ways that children learn is through the process of play. So play is so fundamental to learning. And Piaget says children are learning quite a bit in this process. So a lot of it is this process of assimilation and accommodation. So they'll take objects like a chair and treat them as if they're something else. So the chair can become a horse, right? So they have a schema for a horse, and they will they'll basically treat the chair as a horse, and they'll ignore attributes that don't really fit the activity. And again, of course, there's the young infants will put things into their mouth, ignore that this is a toy, not something that I'm supposed to be sucking on. And there's a lot of that assimilation. And I think that's good, right? I don't want to shortchange assimilation. It sounds like, oh, this is what you do when you're not learning. Assimilation is really critical, because you reinforce certain behaviors that if you go to church, you want the child to assimilate to, oh, in church, I'm probably not supposed to be speaking loudly and yelling and doing certain things. So it's a process of taking in that there's certain things that are expected of me, certain ways that I should behave, and ways that I should respond in these certain situations. And then they also, it also gives them some opportunities for further learning, right? There's still some accommodation as well, where they will start playing in new ways and exploring different schemas through that. So they'll play, cowboy or fireman or firewoman, or they'll try out different activities, and that's that process of accommodation. And Piaget pointed out there's some stages of play. So in stage 1 before 3, they don't really, and you may know this, they don't play according to rules. They don't really have an understanding of rules. Again, this column here is how much understanding do they have and how much do they adhere to the rules here. What's interesting is in stages 2 and 3, so stage 2 is 3 to 5, stage 3 is 5 to 11 or 12. There's an interesting paradox. So in 3 to 5, they believe rules come from God and cannot be changed, but they still break and change rules constantly. It's really interesting. So when they ask, well, who determines the rules? They would say, these rules, they can't be changed. They're ultimate. Again, they might say God, they might say some other authority, but they break it constantly. So it's an interesting paradox, right? They say, oh, these are firm rules, but they break the rules. Here in stage 3, they understand rules are social and they can be changed, but interestingly, they don't actually change them. They adhere to them rigidly. And then finally, in stage 4, they have a complete understanding of rules, that they're social, they can be changed, but they will feel comfortable to change rules by mutual consent, right? So that's good. So if you're playing tag, you might say, oh, well, let's play tag, and if you get tagged, you're able to unfreeze after a minute, right? And then they could change it to 2 minutes. And if everyone agrees, it's fine. So I think that's an interesting thing that Piaget notes. Another thing that Piaget talks about is the process of imitation. Now, imitation, interestingly, it's not assimilation, it's actually accommodation. So when imitating, children modify their behavior. So if you can imagine a child who walks behind their parent who is on the phone and picks up something and acts like they're on the phone too, right? So it's cute. They're imitating. Well, they're trying out a new behavior. They haven't ever maybe talked on the phone before, but they will imitate and act like it is, and that creates the capacity to do new things. So accommodation and imitation is so critical for children to learn how to behave. So by imitating, they're expanding their repertoire of behaviors, and they're also like saying, okay, this is what when you're working, this is what you do. This is what you do. They'll imitate driving or things like that. Again, that prepares them for new capacities as they develop. Piaget noted that one thing that develops is an idea of object permanence. Now, object permanence is this idea that when something is outside of my view, when I can't see it or hear it, it still exists. So in infancy, before the age of about 9 months old, there isn't a sense of object permanence. So if you put something behind them, they're not going to look for it. But at 9, 10 months old, if you put something behind them, if they want to keep playing with it, they're going to turn around, try to get to it. So they have developed a understanding of object permanence. And what Piaget noted is that there's a capacity for deferred imitation, that sometimes a child is able to imitate things in people even when they're not immediately present. And Piaget pointed out that this happens at about 1 year old. So again, I gave the example of a child on a phone and their parent right there. at about 1 year old, they're able to imitate things that they've seen even when they're not there. So there's a representation of, okay, so maybe they pretend like they're on the phone after mom has left for work, and they might still uh, talk on the phone because they recognize they have a memory for mom's behavior. They can represent it. They can and they can emulate it, right? They can copy it, and again, that shows that they've developed a cognitive representation even absent of the stimuli, right? So again, one of the things that the behaviorists miss is this idea, like sometimes stimuli isn't directly being perceived. Maybe it's being represented by using our memory. And again, I think this really expands this idea, like sometimes we are responding to the voice in our head or the image in our head, the representation. And so some of our behaviors are our response to our memories, not to the direct world around us. So I already mentioned this, but Piaget talks about cognitive structures, and I guess I don't have it here, but he argues that changes in cognitive structures, which Piaget calls schemas, you can see them based in a child's actions. So again, you may or may not be familiar with Piaget's stage theory. He argued that there's a series of 4 stages that development progresses through these stages, and each stage is characterized by a more advanced level of adaptation. So first off, when you're born, you're in the sensor-motor stage. So this is from about 0 to 2 years old. And in this stage, you know the world through sensations and motor movements. So you know the world through, again, putting things in your mouth, touching things, feeling them. Kids love textures, young kids like this especially, and they will sense, and then they will move things, right? If you're a parent, kids at this stage love to knock things off their what's the word? If they're eating at the table, a high chair, they'll knock things off the high chair and they'll fall to the ground, and they'll just laugh, or they'll just enjoy it so much you put it back on there, they'll knock it over again, because they're learning about gravity, they're learning about the world around them. And so that's the sensoromotor stage. Then there's the pre-operational stage. In this stage, they have the preconceptual and then the intuitive. And so this is from 2 to 7 years old. And I will show you what this means in later slides as opposed to talking it out. And then after that, there's concrete operations and then formal operations. I'll explain what I mean by operations, but that's a big picture of these stages. So first off, I already kind of unpacked this. The infant has a very here and now understanding of the world. They, at the beginning, they lack an object concept. They lack object permanency. And of course, there's an absence of language. But through an interaction with the world, the infant builds a representation of reality where basic language starts to develop, object permanence develops, ability to coordinate activities. So saying, oh, there's something right there, instead of just looking at it, I'm going to see and reach for it, and the coordination of what I see and what I do, and recognizing cause and effect relationships. Okay, now in the second phase, there's 2 subphases. So pre-operational thinking has, the first subphase is preconceptual. So that's between 2 and 4 years. And then the second is, intuitive. So the first subphase, it's where they react to all similar objects as if they were identical. So they might call any man on the street daddy. They have transductive reasoning. all hairy things are, oh, look at the doggy, mommy, and it's a, you know, a raccoon or something else. They'll attribute life to inanimate objects. So the toy tricked me. So we call this animistic thinking, that things that are not alive, they act as if they are. All right. Now, in the intuitive subphase, this is 4 to 7 years old. They have they start to develop intuitive problem solving, how things should be. They start saying, oh, these things go together because they're both blue. These things go together because they're both big. They have, it's characterized by egocentrism, at least at the start, and at the end, they are able to see things from another's perspective. There's a study that placed them in front of this model with like a volcano and trees, and it was like a little kind of play area, and they asked, what does this little person see? And they sort of said they would see, these trees and this building, and then what would this other, they couldn't actually explain from another person's perspective what that other person might be seeing, which is different what they themselves would see. So they rely on perception rather than logic, and there's an absence of conservation. I'll explain that in a minute. But so during the pre-operational stage, there's a lot of advances in language, mathematical understanding, and reasoning. And so the end of this stage is marked by the discovery of conservation. Okay, so conservation, what is that? Okay, so here you have two balls of dough or of clay, and if I were to ask which of these is bigger, you would be able to recognize that they're the same size. Okay, but if I said which of these is bigger, even though the ball got smashed here, you would say, oh, they're the same size. But younger children would say, oh, well, it's hard to predict what they would say is bigger. They might say this is bigger, or they might say this is bigger. They don't recognize that it's the same mass, and same here. And if I ask all these balls, they'd probably say all these balls are bigger, or this one's the bigger, because they don't have this understanding of things with a certain mass stay a certain mass, even if you change their shape. Oh, sorry, there we go. And then another example, you could say, which of these glasses has more water? Well, they have the same. They could see that. And then if you pour one of the glasses into a beaker, again, you don't know which one they'll say has more, but they will say one has more than the other. They'll either say, oh, this one has more because it's taller, or this one has more because it's wider. Again, not recognizing that the water just moved into the different shaped glass. And here, conservation of number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 6. If you spread out these, and they can actually watch you do this, they'll say that there's more chips here than there are here. Even though, again, they can count it, but so the typical 4 or 5-year-old will insist that the longer line has more. Okay, so the trick you can play on a 4 or 5-year-old is if they are complaining, oh, my sister has more, you can actually break something in half, something like a little cracker or something that you've given to them, and they're going to be happy now because they're like, oh, now I have more because I have 2, not just 1. And yeah, so you can actually play on this and use it for your favor, because again, kids at this phase don't recognize that things stay the same even when you change them. Certain properties of them can stay the same. And so Piaget thought this is really critical. It's just a basic understanding of the world around you requires that you can recognize that, again, when things change, they still maintain some core properties. And so when they're capable of conservation, that is when Piaget says they are in the concrete operations phase. So an operation is an internalized activity, a thought, and it's subject to certain rules of logic. So again, Piaget said the most emblematic of all the operations is this capacity for conservation, because logical thinking is essentially rooted in what is concrete. So to be logical, the basic level of it, you have to know that things have properties that can't be changed. So if they cannot recognize that volume stays the same, then they're not going to be able to think logically. And in this phase, they start to learn that you can classify objects into classes and subclasses. So this is where they would learn in school about, here's an animal, and, be able to recognize, okay, birds, mammals, and different categories of animals and things like that. And they learn to understand the rules about relationships. They also learn how to order objects, put them in order of size and different characteristics. Okay, so this happens between 7 to 11, and yeah, let's see here. I already mentioned that. So children learn to deal more adequately with classes, series, and numbers. And the development, this is interesting. They try to say, can we help kids learn conservation earlier? Well, they tried to do this and said, oh, well, if we just continue to train kids, maybe they will learn how to do this. Well, it doesn't seem like you can accelerate the process of conservation. I mean, you can go back and if you do this enough times, they're going to learn. If you give them feedback, oh, they're the same, they're going to learn to say, oh, they're the same. But this won't generalize to other situations. So if they learn conservation of volume, again, they can learn to just say the right answer, but they don't actually seem to gain the capacity to recognize it. That this actually seems to be a property of just brain development. That kids vary in when they learn conservation, but you can't make them learn it sooner. So it's kind of worthless to try to teach them conservation because they're going to learn it, but they're going to learn it on their own time. In regards to seriation, so the child is given a pile of what are these called? Of figurines, and is asked to sequence them by height. The top row is arranged by a 3.5-year-old. You could see it's not actually arranged by height. And then an 8-year-old did this bottom row, so that you could see that they organized it appropriately. Now, Piaget's fourth and final stage of development is formal operations. This is age 12 and above. And this is where you can actually think with propositions, if then, and you can think about relationships between abstract concepts. So you can deal with hypothetical thoughts. It doesn't have to be concrete. You don't have to see it, feel it. You can actually talk about what is justice, what is beautiful, and you don't have to resort to particular examples of it. So in this stage, thought processes are freed from the immediate and real, and can be and Piaget says at 12 years old, if they gain this capacity, they're as logical as they will ever be. So interesting. So Piaget says you don't become more logical after this. You may learn more things, but the basic structure of your logical process is the same as it was at 12 years old. So again, I know it's hard to kind of absorb all this. So let me review it. So the first stage is sensory-motor. The infant transitions from relying on reflexes to using internal representation, right? To being able to use language. Pre-operational. And again, you have to remember that there's a beginning and end for these stages. So pre-operational, they're developing the capacity for symbolic function, right? Learning to use language more expansively. They're taking on the perspective of others, getting past egocentrism, and they're gaining a basic understanding of conservation of number and qualities. Concrete operations is where they're developing, well, they've developed conservation. They have the ability to classify and to seriate. And then finally, formal operations is this flexible and abstract reasoning. One thing that Piaget has been criticized for is that some of the things that he talks about, they seem to actually occur earlier than what he said. And the other thing is that formal operations, it doesn't seem like all people achieve this stage. Some people continue to use concrete operations for how they approach the world. So just think about that next time you're on Facebook. Okay, so as a theory of learning, it's primarily a theory of human development, but it's also a theory of learning. So what Piaget argues is when we develop knowledge, it's a gradual developmental process, and it's made possible through the interaction of the child with the environment. Children's representation of the world is a function of their stage of development. So how they understand the world shapes how they behave. Maturation, active experience, equilibration, and social interaction are the forces that shape learning. So it's interesting because Piaget has a balance of nature and nurture. He says, well, there's natural processes, right? The brain development, it seems to be, you can't change how the brain is developing, but also nurture in this idea of like, it's all, Piaget says you have to interact with the world around you. That's how you test out things and learn. So if you don't have enough experiences with the environment, you may not learn about certain properties. So Piaget's theory, again, I've given you just an overview of it. Piaget points out, like, you can't just move information into the child. You have to recognize that the child has schemas, so cognitive structures in their mind, in the way that they understand the world, and you have to create. You have to work within. You have to assimilate with the cognitive structures that they have, but you also have to try to accommodate some of them to get them to think differently about certain things and recognize, oh, the way I'm thinking about this is wrong, so I have to change it. So in regards to psychology, we know we can separate knowledge about psychology into different categories. So you have cognitive, social, clinical, neuropsychology, cultural, industrial, organizational health. We have these different categories of knowledge that require some operations to be able to understand psychology. You have to have categorization of it. But we also know that to understand psychology, you have to be out of formal operations because we use theories. We use if-then understandings. We talk about cognitive dissonance. This idea that if we have a dissonance between our behavior and our beliefs, we tend to bend our beliefs. We know about self-medication in regards to psychological distress. Oftentimes people self-medicate with alcohol or drugs. Self-handicapping, reasoned action, all these theories require formal operations. So if we're trying to understand them, we have to have schemas that can think in these abstract manners. So basically, education in psychology is about creating schemas, again, knowledge structures for understanding human functioning. And then we can potentially take that understanding, and when we encounter a patient or a client that is struggling with depression, we could be able to say, oh, I hear the way that you're thinking or the way that you're acting, and you can place it into the structures you have and give them a diagnosis, explain their problem from the perspective of a psychological theory, and then work with them based on that theory to change the way that they're behaving. Okay, and obviously I'm shifting to the clinical implications. So really important is this idea of it's not about just changing the stimuli and the behavior and the consequences. You need to change the way that we're processing and understanding the world. So Piaget's theory gave rise to cognitive therapy, which is that maladaptive schemas, maladaptive ways of thinking about the world and organizing the world can cause problems in functioning. What's an example? Well, if you're working with someone who is depressed, they might have a tendency to assimilate all kinds of interactions with other people into particular schemas. So if they have an interaction and a person seems like they're kind of eager to go, they might say, oh, that I'm basically an unlovable person. The reason why they wanted to go is because of that. I'm an unlovable person. Nobody wants to be around me. Or maybe they have the schema, I fail at everything I do. So they are studying for a test and they get a C on the test and they think, oh, I fail at everything I do. That's just proof. And in cognitive therapy, you help them identify that they have a schema and recognize that they're forcing a bunch of experiences into that schema. So helping them recognize that, oh yeah, the reason why someone might have been eager to leave, maybe it had nothing to do with you. Maybe they were just in a rush to do something else. If you got a C on a test, you actually didn't fail it. You actually prove that you don't fail at everything you do by that grade, and yet they put it into that category. And so helping them rethink and look at the evidence is the key to cognitive therapy. So testing out their schemas and allowing them to change them. So identify them and change them, and being able to do that in a way that again can help them adapt, basically accommodate, right? Develop new schemas, new ways of understanding the world that are maybe a little bit more complex, and maybe acknowledging I fail at some things I do, but I don't fail at everything I do. Instead of I'm basically an unlovable person, recognizing some people may not love me, but I can still be lovable. And it's again more complex understandings, and that is the goal of cognitive therapy. All right, so I'm going to end there. Hopefully you enjoyed this. The next section will be on this character, Lev Vygotsky, and so I am going to wrap up here.